So the dialogue continues. So after this massive downgrading of art, as you said, for a few years in his pantheon of important things, how had his views about truth changed? Ridley. Well, at much the same time that he became convinced that Wagner was a charlatan, he also became convinced that Schopenhauer was also an enemy of everything that was good, too. This was in many ways Nietzsche having his Oedipal moment, growing up and wanting space, and doing it in the classic way by rebelling against his intellectual mentors. But once he had decided that Schopenhauer was also really bad news, that made him very skeptical about the Schopenhauerian metaphysics, which had underpinned what he was doing in The Birth of Tragedy. And it's curious what survived. He comes away from Schopenhauer, even once he has repudiated him, thinking that the world is chaotic, that the world lacks meaning, but no longer thinking that this was a deep metaphysical point. A point to the effect that if we see behind the appearances, then we'll see everything is just turmoil and nonsense. Nietzsche now thinks for a short period in the late 1870s that the best route we have got to the truth is science. And that what science shows is that our ordinary take on the empirical world is hopelessly inadequate. Compared to that take, he says the world is indeed a veritable mishmash. But because science allows us a better apprehension of what the empirical facts actually are, it also holds out the prospect that we might, through that knowledge, attempt to make the world a straightforwardly better place. However, he thought that a lot of the things we'd uncover during the process of becoming more knowledgeable about the truth would be very disturbing. So, from that point of view, he thought that although ultimately we ought to be able to do without art as the provision of illusions, and indeed, although we will come to do without art, once we have got used to the truth and have steeled ourselves in the appropriate ways against it, nevertheless, for the time being, during the period of transition, we'll still hang on to art. Art still has a protective role to play as we gradually uncover the truth about things through science. Warburton, you said that this was a short-lived phase, right? What happened next? Ridley. Well, he realized it had nothing to do with him, and he had spent a couple of years being somebody else. A very good symptom of this is that one of the things that we would be able to do as we become more knowledgeable would be progressively to abolish suffering. And moreover, that would be a thoroughly good thing. Now, this is possibly the most un-Nietzschean thought that Nietzsche ever had. In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche thinks that glimpsing the horrible reality of things and suffering from the illusoriness of one's own individual existence can make one stronger and more vibrant. So suffering is good for you. And he reverts to this view. He returns again and again to ever more vehemently to the thought that there is something actually valuable about at least some suffering. So, the attempt to abolish suffering altogether as a way of making life better, Nietzsche went back to thinking, is in fact a classic expression of a life that no longer has the energy for itself. It's an expression of a life that is declining into complacent uninterestingness. Warburton. The way in which art shapes an apparently formless reality was also mirrored in what he said about how we might approach our own lives. Isn't it? Ridley. That's right, yes. Once he's come out of this science positivist period, Nietzsche still thinks that the world is inherently chaotic, indifferent to human purposes and human needs. It is a meaningless world, and this presents us with some challenges, particularly if we don't want to avail ourselves of some of the more obvious ways we might have of dealing with apparent senselessness. One way would be the Socratic Christian way, according to Nietzsche, which would be to say that this meaningless is only apparent, and that if one looks hard enough and thinks hard enough, one will see that actually it's all for the good, it's all for the best, in the best of all possible worlds, where the best is a world that in fact transcends this one. Now, Nietzsche thinks that that's a fantasy, a dangerous fantasy that we should have learned to do without. In effect, what we are left with, for Nietzsche, is a chaotic, meaningless world, but not one in a deep Schopenhauerian sense, just in a straightforward, immediate and direct sense, which we ought to know better than to try to make palatable to ourselves by telling wholesale big lies about it in the way that he thinks Socrates told just very big lies, and Christianity, which always, according to Nietzsche, tells very big lies. What we have to do instead, he thinks, is to tell little lies. Lies that don't falsify the entire character of existence, but which locally have the effect of making portions of existence bearable. He thought we can do that by the way in which we think about the world that we live in. But also, as you say, we can do it by making something of an illusion of ourselves by, as he famously puts it, giving style to our character. The idea is that we might become works of art, that we might improve ourselves through a certain self-directed artistry.